Okay, well, since it is the beginning of the year, we're actually doing sort of a double whammy, at least on the women. The women are starting Romans this week. Woo! It's a great read. It's just a great read. And so I'm going to abuse you by also piling on top of you Hebrews. So we're going to look at Hebrews here on Sundays. So actually, it'll be a pretty interesting brain explosion for the ladies to do these two at the same, because it probably, when people talk about the books of the New Testament, Romans and Hebrews are like up there like, oh no, I'm sorry, that's like graduate level. I can't do that this week. That's just, not only are they too long, but they're just too deep, and I got too much heavy. I can't do that. Well, we're going to do it anyway, so we don't care. But the interesting thing is we never really have a good rationale for looking at Hebrews. I mean, we often go away from Hebrews. And let me tell you what the rationale normally sounds like for why we don't read Hebrews. It goes something like this. Wait a second. Wait. We're not Jewish. Is this really meant for us? Yeah. Good. Okay, well, good. Well, yeah, so my answer normally is, well, it's a bridge in a way. It's a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Oh, but the New Testament is enough, isn't it? I mean, besides, all those bloody sacrifices are obsolete, so why connect with all this bloody stuff? Why do that? Why do this all this obsolete stuff? Well, because that obsolete stuff was written for our benefit. The Old Testament is for the Jews. It's not for us. No. Listen to this. Peter says in 1 Peter 1:10, concerning this salvation, we're talking about salvation through Jesus, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, and if I skip down a couple of verses, but it was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves, but you. What are we talking about? The prophets of the Old Testament. So the prophesied, and it hadn't affected the time, but it was written down for you. And we seldom go there. So Hebrews is going to be our bridge into the Old Testament in a lot of ways. But it's sort of misunderstood how it is. Paul said it too, though. Romans 15:4. For whatever was written in former days, Old Testament, was written for our instruction. For us. And he says it again in Corinthians 10. 1 Corinthians 10. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down. They were written down for our instruction. So we're connecting to something that was meant for us, on whom the end of the ages has come. So even though that's Old Testament, the end of the ages has come upon us, and what was written down in the Old Testament was for us who are at the end of the age. And that shocks a lot of believers. But the Old Testament just hints about Jesus, and the New Testament, it tells us about him directly. So the Old Testament is kind of vague in comparison to the New Testament, seems like, right? Well, is it sort of like a shadow? Is that what you're saying? Exactly. It seems sort of like a shadow. It's shadowy. It's not really clear. Well, the writer of Hebrews actually agrees with you when you call it kind of shadowy. This is what he said about the Old Testament priests. The writer of Hebrews says about the Old Testament priests in Hebrews 8. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. So see, there you go. Shadow, copy. Okay, let's just go read Luke instead of the shadows. I mean, isn't that clearer? Isn't that more straightforward? There's no shadow. There's no copies. It's the real thing. It's Jesus. Right? Well, but these shadows right here tell us more than Luke can. Really? Yes. I don't see how. Well, the things that we cannot see, the heavenly things. So it's still very relevant, what's backed in the Old Testament. If they're a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, can you see the heavenly things because you've read the New Testament? Not really. I mean, we get more shadows is what we get in the New Testament of the real heavenly things. So these shadows, these copies in the Old Testament are telling us about something that we still can't see yet. So that's very valuable. Things that are not even in the New Testament. You mean things about Jesus that we haven't seen? Can the Old Testament tell us things about Jesus that we haven't seen about him in the New Testament? And the answer to that is yes. You got an example? Okay, here's an example. You know about the veil in the temple, right? Right. It kept unworthy people out of the Holy of Holies, God's presence. Sinful people couldn't go there. Right. Okay, so put that together with this, wherever it is. There it is. Clicker's bad. Mark 15:38. And the veil of the temple, this is at Jesus' death, at the crucifixion, and the veil of the temple was torn into from top to bottom. So what do you put together about the veil picture that we don't really know that well about in the rest of the New Testament? Well, because of that, which is an Old Testament connection, you can say, you mean our access to God has changed? We can come into his presence? Exactly. The nearness of God is at issue of the crucifixion, right? Well, I thought the cross was all about our sin. Well, it is, but it robs us from the nearness of God. That's the import of it, see? And you get that from the Old Testament shadow. But never mind. The veil is just a shadow. Let's read Luke. Okay, I get it. So these Old Testament shadows, aren't they obsolete? In fact, doesn't the writer of Hebrews say they're obsolete? Why are we studying obsolete stuff? Well, in their doing, yes, they are obsolete. But in their meaning, no, they're not obsolete. So why call all this Old Testament stuff shadows? I mean, it just sounds so fuzzy. Sounds harder. Why call them shadows at all? No, it's actually the opposite. It's not fuzzy. It's exactly the opposite of being fuzzy. Shadows are always true to the real thing. Now, so, many times we talk about shadowy characters because they're not clear, they're lurking in the darkness, you don't exactly know what's going on. But when he uses shadows here in Hebrews, he's talking about a different kind of thing than shadowy. He's talking about when you stand outside in a clear sunlit day, you cast a shadow, and that shadow does not lie about you. It has to tell the truth about you. It perfectly reflects who you are, sometimes not to your liking, but sometimes, but it is accurate. It doesn't try and be what you're not, but it is a perfectly accurate representation from 3D into 2D. I'll let that mess with your mind a little bit while. Okay, shadows are always true to the real thing. Well, which is useful when we can't see the real thing, right? Bingo, exactly. So we still, even with the New Testament, cannot see the real thing, which is the heavenly reality. We still haven't seen that yet. In the Old Testament, it gives us a shadow, which is a perfect cast shadow of the reality of the things we can't see yet. So the Old Testament is not obsolete. It's just a picture shadow that's exactly representative of heaven that we often overlook in understanding. And there are images about what heaven is like and who God is that we don't have an advantage of in the New Testament even. So we're filling out your experience card here. In fact, you could say, so hold on to your seats, you could say that the Old Testament rituals allowed the real Jesus to cast his shadow back in time. It's more than that, but that's a good start. And they were supposed to get it? I mean, when you read the Old Testament, do you get Jesus in there? Well, yeah, sort of. It helps us because we've read the New Testament, we see connections. But could a Jew read the Old Testament and get a picture of Jesus, get a shadow of who the Son of God is? Is that actually possible? Well, Jesus sure expected the Pharisees to get it. John 5:39, he took them down. He rebuked the Pharisees. You search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. Jesus expected them to get it. It was a perfect message for them. They should have read the Old Testament and all that they knew, and they should have got it. They should have been waiting for the Messiah to come. They could have given you a whole description of what the Messiah would be like, not only the kingly Messiah, but the suffering Messiah. They should have got that, but they didn't. And Jesus takes them down right here. You guys are the best informed about my coming. And you read it and you think that in the Scriptures, the doing of those things in the Scriptures, all those laws and the sacrifice, you think that in those you find life. But if you don't find me in the Old Testament, you don't find life. So he takes them down right there. That's the expectation. Whew. But wait a second. Wait. As I look at this, it seems like that passage sounds like the Pharisees were more hung up on the shadows than they were on who was casting them. Exactly. And that's what Jesus is taking them to task about. Doesn't mean that the shadows are inaccurate, but they did not want to see who was casting the shadow, and that was Jesus himself. And that right there, that observation is a big reason for why Hebrews was written at all. Because the shadow of what was in the Old Testament, the shadow of who the Son of God is in the Old Testament, God's plan for mankind, it was very clear there. And yet that generation, up to the time of Jesus, put more stock in the actual actions of enabling the shadows rather than trying to say, what does that shadow mean? What is it telling me about who God is and what's coming? So everything that you see in the Old Testament, although very real, it was real Israelites that left, a real Egypt, and the suffering in the desert. I mean, everything there is real. However, it's orchestrated as a way of informing us about who God is, what heaven's like, and what his plan for us is. And it's all there frozen in these actions. And so the writers of both the Old and New Testament say these are kind of shadows of a much greater reality. And that's what Hebrews really goes for. It talks about what we can learn from those shadows. And that's what it's really great. Okay. Paul says this straight up to the young church in Colossae. Listen to what he says here now about the shadow. Colossians 2:16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink. That's kosher rules. Food and drink, or with regard to a festival, like the 3 times you had to go to Jerusalem in the year, or a new moon, which is when they started their months, always on a new moon, the Jewish calendar, or the Sabbath. Don't let anyone judge you according to that. Why? These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Paul right there has written what the Jews considered totally heretical statements. He says, you shouldn't care about the Sabbath. You shouldn't care about the new moon, the beginning of the calendar cycles. You shouldn't care about festivals. It's all about the substance. Those are shadows. Those are shadows. The substance is Christ. Wow. Is he saying that everything that went on in the Old Testament was wrong? No. But what he is saying is that those are a shadow, and we have Christ. The substance is Christ. Okay? So we'll work on that as we go along, because how Paul came to this conclusion is, I think, why there was a delay between his Damascus Road experience and before he went on doing public ministry. He had to put this together in his head. Whew. Okay. So the source of the Old Testament shadows, Jesus. That's key in Hebrews. What's the source of the shadows? What's casting the shadows of the Old Testament actions? Is that key? Yeah. And the writer wastes no time. In fact, I'll call him the writer of Hebrews instead of his name, because we don't know who wrote Hebrews. It was presumed for a long time that it was Paul. But when you read it, even when you read the English translation of the Greek, and you read that, it doesn't match the English kind of style and grammar of what Paul does in his other writings. So there's something just there's different. And people who are really studied in Greek look at it and say, yeah, it's for one thing, it's classier Greek. It's much better educated Greek than Paul. Well, yeah. Which narrows actually the list of who could possibly have written it. But the issue isn't so much who wrote it, and it's really the issue of what's the content of it. Let's look at the content and let's weigh it. So that's what we're looking at. So the writer, he wastes no time getting to the source of the shadows. And in a way, what he does is what even like we know, like in the book of John, where they take the conclusion of what they're going to write about in the next many chapters, and they stick it in the front. Many times we write like a murder mystery. Murder mystery, you get all these facts, and then you finally synthesize it into an answer at the end, right? Or you cheat and you read that first, right? This is different. In ancient techniques, what they would do is they say, let me give you the bottom line conclusion that I'm going to talk about coming. I'll give it to you right up front. And what your response ought to be is, oh yeah? Well, prove it. Well, I'm glad you asked. Here we go. That's John. In the beginning was the Word. What? And the Word was with God. Whoa. And the Word was God. What? He puts that right out there in front. And then he goes about showing you why he came to that conclusion. This is the same here. So as the writer here starts to look at the shadows, which will come up in a few minutes, we'll start talking about these shadows and what they mean and what we can learn from them. He's going to start first with who's casting that shadow? What's the substance, like Paul says, the substance that's casting that shadow. And so when he starts out in Hebrews, he says, I'm going to give you my conclusion right off the top. So boom, he goes right at it. His first sentence is all about Jesus. And by the way, we are only going to look at his first sentence today. Yeah, we're going to give you the conclusion. So if you don't want a proof text about how he came to that conclusion, you can just skip it after that and read the first sentence and be done. But it's no fun. It's just no fun. His first sentence is all about Jesus, but from a heavenly perspective, and it's bigger than Luke's human perspective. So what did he do? Well, before I step into those first verses where he talks about the Jesus who casts his shadow into the Old Testament, I'm subtitling this whole series Shadowland. Now, that's the name of a book by C.S. Lewis, and I'm not copying why he used that word. Many times in English, Shadowland does mean the place where shadowy people are, where people lurk. Well, it's kind of dark and you can't tell what's going on, you know. When you think Shadowland from classic English literature perspective, think Jack the Ripper. What? Okay, in the sense that he lurked in the shadows and there was imminent danger, but you couldn't tell. That's Shadowland in classic English usage. That's a Shadowland. But I'm using it in a different kind of way. Shadowland here is a place, that's the Old Testament, where there are shadows, yes, that are perfect representations of what you cannot see yet. And so we're going to dwell on those shadows because they cast perfectly what's going on from a heavenly perspective. And so they're actually not causing fuzziness, they're causing clarity. And we're going to find clarity in the shadows of the Old Testament. That kind of shadow. Crisp, clear, well-defined. The shadow moves with the movement of heaven. The shadow moves with you as you move. It's a perfect 2D representation of what you cannot see yet. And that's what we're going to study. So really the study of Hebrews is an introduction and kind of a commentary on these well-defined shadows in the Old Testament. So you and I can gain an understanding about heaven that we cannot see yet. Someday we will, but we can't right now. Okay, so Shadowland, Hebrews, which is why I put this picture up to start with, which I didn't even explain, but I will now. And why this picture? Well, this picture is normally used about the aspiration of a pawn to be a king on a chessboard. And that's not how we're going to use it right here. When you looked at Jesus in the first century, when you look at the Jesus of Luke and the Gospels, you see what looks like just a normal pawn of a man. He's just a man, seems like. Now, he starts doing different kinds of things, which changes your thinking about who he is. But at first measure, he just looks like a pawn. But the shadow he casts is the shadow of a king. Get it? And he not only casts that shadow in the first century, but who he is as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that shadow casts into the Old Testament and gives us understanding about the Son of God in a way that his pawn image doesn't give us any immediate understanding. Huh? Eh? Eh? Ah, yeah, you'll get there. Okay, so let's read it. Here we go. Mark, set, go. Verse 1. Long ago. It sounds a little like Star Wars, but just get away from that. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. And that was right. The prophets being who? You know, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all those guys. God spoke, and he spoke the truth about heavenly things through the words of the prophets. So he gave us an understanding through the words of the prophets about what's going on in heaven. However, in these last days, did you know you're in the last days? You people who are interested in eschatological topics, that's end times topics, yeah, we're in the last days. As soon as the Messiah showed up in the flesh in human history, last days started. That's a key. And when he shows up the second time, the last days stop. And then we're in another age. Okay, we can go forever on that, but we're not. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Clearly a superior way to understand the unseen things of heaven is through the Son, not the prophets. Now this implies that maybe the ministry of prophets to give us an understanding of what's going on is obsolete. May not exactly be, but clearly he's making the point right here that if the Son can come and give us an understanding of heavenly things, it's got to be superior than what God told the prophets. I mean, it's got to be just much more, because this is his Son. This is his Son. And it reminds you of that parable Jesus told. Remember that parable where the vineyard owner runs his vineyard, but he's got to go away on business, so he gives it to sharecroppers to kind of run the vineyard and to make the wine, and they can profit from all the profits of the grapes, all the profits of the wine. All the owner said was, give me 10% and we're good. By the way, that's the basis for tithe, is if you're a sharecropper for someone else who owns the land. And when Israel moved into the land of Israel, they were sitting on God's land. So God asked them to pay a tenth. That's a sharecropper idea. Anyway, and in that parable, they stopped paying the 10%. That's bad. So the owner started sending emissaries, prophets, to come and say, you guys, this was the understanding. You really needed to pay this money. And they treated them quite terribly. Remember that? And then finally, the owner says, well, I'll fix this. I'll send my Son. He has authority and power to speak for me. It's as though I myself were going. They'll recognize and they'll respect him, and everything will be put right. And they looked at the Son and they said, well, he's going to inherit everything, including this land. It's going to be his. If we kill him, the inheritor's gone and we can take the land. Woo-hoo. It didn't work out well for them. Well, that whole picture, that parable, is exactly what we're talking about right here. I mean, exactly. God spoke to us about the realities and the truth of heaven and about salvation, the nature of man, the nature of God, through the prophets, and they did a great job. I would highly recommend you read the prophets in the Old Testament. My favorite, Isaiah, no question. But Jeremiah rocks. And Ezekiel, hearts of stone turned into hearts of flesh in Ezekiel. I mean, there's great stuff there. So they gave us great understandings, but nothing like when God sends his Son. Nothing like. I mean, now we're talking about a whole different level of understanding. So God spoke to us through his prophets, but now he has spoken to us in these last days by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, just like the parable, which means when he's heir of all things, that means he inherits everything, which excludes nothing. Everything. Everything. Go outside at night and look up at the stars. Everything. He's the inheritor of everything. That's how important he is. And through whom he also created the world. Now remember, this is his conclusion. This is his conclusion from the shadows of the Old Testament. This is his conclusion from the 2D contours of the shadows that are there in the Old Testament. He's spoken to us by his Son, authority, respect, whom he appointed the heir of all things going to him. Through him, all things, he created the world. He's making a pretty big case for Jesus to start off. And you notice, this is not a human perspective description of Jesus. This is a heavenly perspective description of Jesus. He goes on about this one who casts the shadow. He is the radiance of the glory of God. Now, when we see the word glory, it almost always should give you the idea of a light, a shining light, a bright kind of thing. But he uses this word radiance, and when you look at this word radiance, he adds a prefix in making this word that means that the light goes out. Like it really is out bright is what it means. And so, I mean, it could be like, you have wouldn't it be silly if you had a flashlight and you turn it on, but instead of letting it illuminate the room, you just kind of cup it around your eyes and go, whoa, it's really bright. Whoa, this is bright. But then when you aim it out, it's out bright. Well, that's exactly what this word is. It's like a flashlight in the dark shining out. So even though God is bright in terms of his glory, he determined through the Son to make that brightness shine into his creation, into mankind. His idea is to shine into mankind. Just like the radius of a circle. So this is the idea of the Son of God, of Jesus. He is a way in which the prophets could not quite describe the radiance of who God is himself. You mean everything about who Jesus is shining something about the nature of God? Yes. The radiance of the glory of God. Wow. And then he uses another metaphor right here, and he's the exact imprint of his nature. The exact imprint of his nature. And even though you and I don't read much Greek, you would recognize this Greek word for imprint, because it's the word literally pronounced in Greek, character. Well, a character, when the printing press started, you would take a mold of a letter that had a relief on it, and you would press it, you'd roll ink on it, and you'd press it into page and then pull it back, and it would be a perfect imprint of the character. It's a perfect representation. Just like we were talking about shadows are perfect representations of the solid thing. This character is a perfect imprint of the reality, which is God himself. And so it was used often, many times, for stuff like this, for coins. And there's Queen Elizabeth. I miss her already. And I'm not a real royal fan, but her influence on the United Kingdom is really quite undersold. She was a stable, wise, measured ruler. So in that sense, I miss her, because when you have someone like that, whether it's King or Queen of England, or whether it's a President of the United States, or whether it's anything, a governor, often you have to give thanks to God for people like that, because many times the person who replaces them is not. But so anyway, so this character idea was also the idea that when you took a coin die and you pressed it into metal really hard and you pulled it away, you had a perfect imprint of this. So in these two ideas right here, he's saying that Jesus is a perfect human representation of things that you'll never know if he wasn't here. He's a perfect representation. He's the outshining of who God is, the greatness of who God is. He's a perfect replica in human flesh of the divine God. Yeah.
Just use this information. That's not a quarter.
It's a 50p piece, I think.
No, I forgot what I was going to know. It was in the old money. It was actually something else, but I forgot.
Yeah, I think when I was in England, this was a 50p piece. It's a half a pound piece.
That was after metrics.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a farthing before.
It was a farthing before, yeah. Don't mind us. So, okay, and then it goes on, and if that were not enough, this Jesus who walked in the flesh in the first century, he upholds the universe by the word of his power. He upholds the universe. Great translation. He literally upholds the universe with what? His strength and might? No, with the word of his power. By the way, if you go back to Genesis 1, oh wait, that's how things were made. God spoke, and it happened. And he continues to uphold the creation as it is by the word of his power. That is just a bizarre overstatement. I mean, it's just like, it's bigger than my mind can even wrap around. You mean everything that's here stays together because he holds it together? I mean, it implies that he upholds the universe. It implies that if he stops doing this, it all just kind of goes psh, and vapors. That's the end of that, which means not only the chair you're sitting on, the concrete floor that it's sitting on, but you and every atom in your body, psh, and he upholds it because he says it's got to stick by the word of his power. And when he gives another word, I mean, you see that again in eschatological literature, end-time literature. There's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, and the old one's just kind of going to go. But the fact that we are here today, like we were yesterday, is only because of the power of his word. So this Jesus, this Luke version of Jesus, who looks just like some kind of itinerant preacher from the back hills of Nazareth, this guy is holding it together. Yeah, that's not our opinion. That's heaven's perspective on him. So I wondered, how big is that universe? Well, now we have the James Webb Telescope, and James Webb Telescope decided to replicate one of the most famous pictures from Hubble when Hubble first went up, and it's this picture right here, and this is the James Webb version of it. Let's scroll down a little bit. Every little white dot is a star, and these colored things are gases. It's actually where stars are being formed, and when you see red dots in those clouds of gases, you see newly formed stars are starting right there. This is according to infrared imagery. And so this was in the top 10 list of pictures in the Hubble telescope. So the James Webb guy says, we can do that. So they dialed in and they looked at this. You know what this picture is called in shorthand? It's the Eagle Nebula, but they call it the Pillars of Creation. And why? I mean, these are scientists. Call this the Pillars of Creation because it's actually a nursery for stars. Those dust gases that are on the colors and yellow stuff, they're actually birthing stars right here, is what this is. So you're seeing the universe, you're seeing stars being created. So they call this the Pillars of Creation. I'm sure that nagged somebody in the secular science community. But this is what it's called to this very day. It's called that. But it's in, I think it's in the Eagle Nebula. In fact, if we do our red shifting calculation of distances correctly in astronomy, then this light right here started coming to us 7,000 years ago, and it's just now getting here. It predates Abraham. These images right here. So you're looking way back into the past. Whew. Well, every dot on that picture he upholds by the word of his power. I'm not kidding. Go out at night and see the stars and go, everything? Everything. I think that's why it was so influential in the faith journey of Abraham, was that he battled with God about whether coming up with this nation of people who would be, related to him. Can this really happen? And when he stepped out and looked under the stars and went, well, he did that. He believed, and it was counted him as righteousness. There's something about what's in the sky that God has put there to humble us and give us an understanding that he's got everything in control. Whew. I mean, everything in here. By the way, the stars that have like a star pattern on them, it's because of how it's put together, those are actually closer to us than the nebula itself. And the stars in the background that don't have little stars on them, they're behind the nebula. So it's, man. He upholds the universe by the word of its power. Okay. And if that were not enough, so stop, stick that hard in your mind. This is the one who keeps everything together, through whom everything was made, and now he has done something remarkable for all mankind. This is the conclusions of the writer of Hebrews. And what is it? After making purification for sins, which, by the way, if you're a New Testament-y person, you'll think this picture when you talk about purification of sins. If you're an Old Testament-y person, you'll think of this picture for the purification of sins. And that tells us something insightful about that purification, because they both apply. If you didn't have the Old Testament picture, you'd be missing a big chunk of the shadow of what you can't see yet. The heavenly picture. Okay, so after making the purification of sins, the guy who's holding the entire universe together, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And that brings to image a throne room. I mean, he goes to the place of control and domination of the whole universe and authority in the throne room of universe. Okay, wait. This is a gigantic statement. This is a gigantic statement. The one who holds everything together went through the process of purification for sins. This is all sins, including the ones you've done and the ones you'll do tomorrow. And somehow he has accomplished that. And at the same time, the one who accomplished that purification, which we understand from the shadows of the Old Testament, have something to do with blood. Interesting. And now he's the one that sits on the throne. This sentence should not exist in one phrase. I mean, it just doesn't seem to go together. I mean, you've got sacrifice and you've got rule in one sentence. By the way, so far in these first couple verses, we're still in the opening sentence. It's one Greek sentence about who this person is. And having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now he's going to introduce the next topic, and we're going to stop here and look at that next time. But Jesus has a name that the angels never had. So that means that he's something much bigger than angels. During this time, they were kind of hung up on angels. Angels are the real Power Rangers of the Old Testament. I mean, every time you see something really big happen, it seems to be angels doing it. When David was dealing with sins in his life, God said, I'm going to take a single angel and destroy all of Jerusalem. What? What? It doesn't seem to take a lot of them to make things happen. So yeah, they were kind of the superheroes of the Old Testament. So when Jesus comes along, people who are more, enamored with the shadows than they are the reality, they'll look at angels and say, well, the angels, they're the cool ones. Well, not compared to the one who holds the universe together. Not compared to the one who made a purification for sins. Not for the one who sits on the right hand of the Father. Oh, so he's going to correct that in the next couple verses at the end of chapter 1. We'll look at that next week. But he does have a different name, and his name that's different from the angels is the Son of God. Remember, I spoke through the prophets, and now I'm speaking through the Son. So if he is the Son, he's clearly superior to the angels. And he'll make his case. He'll make his first case in all of Hebrews about how you're too stuck up on the images of the shadows. And we'll talk about that just with respect to this. Just with respect to this. Okay, we're going to quit. Oh, good. Okay, look. Shadowland is what we're looking at. The place where the shadows might actually give us more understanding than the reality of the human Jesus. Because, by the way, everything about the reality of heaven, which we cannot see, is reflected through who Jesus is. But then there's a whole raft of that entirety of that topic that's reflected in all the shadows that are cast into the Old Testament. So in reality, what we're doing, we are fully equipped with our pawn idea of who Jesus is as fully man. But now we're going to venture into this incredible domain where we're going to look at the kind of shadow that Jesus casts from heaven, which was effectively shadowed into the Old Testament. And I would maintain, and this will kind of blow your mind, and we'll prove this later, that even the coming of Jesus in the flesh is a shadow of the reality that we haven't seen yet. And the reason I say that is because he just told us his conclusions about who Jesus is from a heavenly perspective. Well, I can read Luke and I won't get a half of that. I get a little of it, but not that much. So what he's saying right here is, I got this from reading the Old Testament shadows. So why don't you join me? We'll look at these shadows one at a time. We'll kind of pick them apart. We'll see what they're telling us about what we can't see yet. And we'll add to our understanding that the Gospels have already given us a full account of. We'll add to our understanding of what's really going on that we missed when we just focused on the man Jesus and not the Son of God in heaven Jesus. You mean we can look in the Old Testament at something like this, the tabernacle. We can look at the tabernacle and we can pull something relevant about Jesus out of that? Whoa, you're going to have to hold on to your seats. We'll have to install seat belts. Because that picture right there is one of the most carefully described shadows of the Old Testament. In fact, when you read, we just finished reading Exodus together. When you read Exodus, when you read where God said, you're going to build me a tent, then I'm going to live in your midst, you're going to put your tents around me when we camp, I'm going to be in my tent in the middle of your camp, that's what's going to happen. And by the way, I want every inch of this tent a specific way. Do not deviate from it. And why was that? Because God is creating a detailed shadow of the heavenly things, both with respect to who we are and who the Messiah is and God's plan for all mankind. You mean in that? Buddy, in that right there. So it'll take a little bit of tutoring for us, and that's what the writer of Hebrews is going to do for us. A little tutoring for us so we can look at that. And it'll also dispel any people who are too hung up on the shadows that they're not really going to the next phase, which is to say, what does this really tell me about God? For instance, you already know that in the very center of this, in the very far right of that picture, is the Holy of Holies, right? Only one person could go in there once a year. That was the high priest. And when he went in, what did he go in for? What did he do to accomplish? He spilled blood on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, and he dealt with the sins of the people, the Day of Atonement. Well, why, when you come into the presence of God, would you have to deal with sin? Well, that's what we're going to find out when we look at the pictures. Because the operation of this structure right here, which was so meticulously designed by God, it's like a painter in heaven giving you a paint by numbers instruction book and saying, you can't see what's going on up here, but I'm going to give you the exact contours of what to make, and in that, and in the function of that, you'll get it. You'll get it. Now, we look at this, and we say, I don't see much Jesus here. Let's go back to Luke. Just hold on. You'll see it. And in fact, what he talks about throughout the entire Old Testament in terms of these shadows, you'll get a twofold understanding of the coming of this Messiah through this and through so much more. You'll get a twofold understanding. In this picture, the fact that he offers sacrifice as well as is the sacrifice, and the fact that because of that he is not only the one who rules and the one who intercedes, but he's the one who dies on our behalf. Right there. It's all right there. It's all right there. And so you'll see these two streams of revelation in the Old Testament about what God's intention for the leader of God's people is. His intention for him is that he would not only be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, but he would be the sacrificed lamb. There's one right there. Everything about who he is in this picture. But it'd be a little confusing at the beginning, and it confused the Jews for a while, because when they looked at the Old Testament and they saw mentions that they could connect to this coming king, they'd say he's the King of Kings and he's going to right all wrongs and he's going to be uber justice guy, and everything that's been done dirt to us, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. All right, do it, God. Let's have some vengeance. So he comes as a great bringer of justice, but he's also the one that loves us and draws us near. That's actually the point of all that. But the people of the Old Testament, they liked the kingly part, but they didn't really like the other suffering part. Why would a king have to suffer? Isn't the king the only one in the entire culture who does not suffer? Look at Kim Jong-il. He's clearly eating well when the rest of the country is dying. So isn't the king the only one who really has a great life going? Would he ever suffer? And the recipe for our participation in God's kingdom is that he does have to suffer. And so this whole picture right here is consumed with the issue of our sin. That whole structure. So God says, this is just a sneak preview, God says, I want to live in your midst. I want to camp in your midst. I want to go with you where you're going. I want you to camp around me, put your tents around me. I'll be living right there. But by the way, although I want to be in your midst, we're going to spend all our time dealing with your sin. Well, why is that? So we'll get there. We'll get there. So that's just by way of mentioning that we sing this because that's who we'll find when we read in the Old Testament. The King of, not Israel, the King of heaven. The King of heaven has come down, and we'll see that. We'll see his shadow cast perfectly on the ground in the Old Testament. And we'll look at the contours of it and go, I never saw that in Luke. You're right. You're going to love this. This is a blast. This is a blast. Now, for those who were here 10 to 12 years ago, I taught this, I think, 12 years ago. And basically, part of my reason for doing it again is because I've just missed it. And maybe you've been too intimidated to look into Hebrews. It's a trip. It's a trip. But just remember, although the enactment of the shadows is obsolete, the meaning is not. Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us this exquisite book. We pray that through your Holy Spirit that we gain understanding about the things that we don't know right now, that we gain understanding about who you are, what your plans for us are, the consequences of our sin, your desire to live among us and your desire to live in us, that we would gather from all these old pictures an understanding of the reality of the substance of heaven that we look so forward to seeing with our own eyes but haven't yet. And that as a result of that, you would encourage our hearts that the one who holds the entire universe together has called us to himself to be near. I almost can't even contain what I just said in my mind. But that's what you revealed to us as we read through Hebrews. So we look forward to that, to God, and pray that your Spirit would give us understanding that we don't have now, and that we might be encouraged and fall that much more deeper in love with you as a result. So thank you. We look forward to this. Amen.